The knee strike to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan's skull is delivered with 187 pounds of force, enough pressure to fracture the C2 vertebrae, enough impact to render most combat-trained soldiers unconscious, enough violence to end a career, though not in the way Captain Wade Thornton intended. She didn't scream, she didn't fight back, she didn't give him the satisfaction of a single sound. When he finally released her, grinding his kneecap one last time against the base of her skull, for emphasis, she rose in a single fluid motion. No hands for support, no stumbling, no weakness. She simply stood, the way a statue might rise, if gravity suddenly reversed itself and dusted off her uniform with two precise pats. Left shoulder, right shoulder. Her movements carried the mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled machine performing routine maintenance. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were the color of the Atlantic in winter, gray-blue and utterly depthless. They held no anger, no pain, no fear. They held nothing at all, and that emptiness was more unnerving than any threat could ever be. "Is the demonstration complete, Captain?" Her voice was flat, professional, the tone a surgeon might use when asking for a scalpel. 72 hours later, Wade Thornton would be begging for a medical discharge. His career wouldn't just end. It would be erased the way fire erases paper, leaving nothing but ash and the memory of something that once existed. This is how it happened. The Joint Urban Warfare Training Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, sprawled across 200 acres of carefully orchestrated chaos. Kill houses stood like brutal concrete monuments to the art of close-quarters violence. Shooting ranges stretched toward distant tree lines. Obstacle courses twisted through mud and wire. It was a place designed to transform soldiers into something harder, sharper, more lethal. On a Tuesday morning in late September, as the Carolina sun burned through the last traces of dawn mist, a woman arrived at the main gate driving a rental sedan that had seen better days. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, running shoes that had logged serious miles. Her hair, a dark red that caught copper highlights in the morning sun, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She showed her military ID to the gate guard, a young private who barely glanced at it before waving her through. He didn't notice the absence of any unit designation. He didn't notice the unusual security clearance level. He noticed only that she was a woman alone, driving toward a training facility where women were rare and often unwelcome. He certainly didn't notice that she moved with the contained stillness of a predator in unfamiliar territory, that her eyes swept the facility with the systematic precision of someone conducting a tactical assessment, that her hands, resting loosely on the steering wheel, bore the calluses of someone who had spent years gripping a rifle until it became an extension of her body. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan, parked in the designated visitor lot, killed the engine and sat for exactly 30 seconds in absolute stillness. She was breathing in a specific pattern. 4 seconds in through the nose, 4 seconds held, 4 seconds out through the mouth, 4 seconds held. The combat breathing technique that had kept her alive through 11 deployments and situations that would have broken most operators before they'd even processed what was happening. In her right hand, she held a photograph. The edges were worn soft from handling. The image showed two women in desert camouflage rifles slung across their backs, arms around each other's shoulders. Both were grinning, despite the visible exhaustion in their faces. Behind them, the bombed-out skeleton of a building in Fallujah stood, testament to the chaos they'd survived. The woman on the left was Sarah Younger, by 9 years, her face not yet marked by the scar that now traced a pale line from her left shoulder blade to her collarbone. The woman on the right was Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes. Blonde hair, bright smile, eyes that held both kindness and an edge sharp enough to cut. Rebecca Hayes had died in Ramadi in 2009, a bullet through the throat during a building clearance. She'd bled out in 43 seconds while Sarah held pressure on the wound and screamed for a medic who couldn't reach them through the firefight. The official after-action report cited enemy fire as the cause of death. The unofficial truth, the one that Sarah had spent years piecing together through old training records and whispered conversations with soldiers who'd served under the same instructors, was more complicated. Rebecca Hayes had hesitated. 0.4 seconds, an eternity in close-quarters combat. Her muscle memory had frozen at the critical moment because chronic back pain, the kind that comes from repeated training injuries, had sent a warning spike through her nervous system just as she'd begun her entry. In that point 0.4 seconds, the enemy combatant had acquired his target. The chronic back pain had a source. His name was Wade Thornton. He'd been Rebecca's instructor at Ranger School in 2007. He'd believed that breaking students physically was the path to making them stronger. He'd believed that women in combat roles needed to be pushed twice as hard to prove they deserved to be there. He'd believed a lot of things that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with his own insecurities wrapped in the flag of tradition. Rebecca had never filed a complaint. She'd endured, she'd graduated, she'd gone on to become one of the finest combat leaders Sarah had ever served with. And then she'd died because her body, remembering old pain, had betrayed her for 0.4 seconds. Sarah placed the photograph in the center console face down. She didn't need to look at it anymore. The image was carved into her memory with the permanence of scar tissue. She stepped out of the car. The September heat hit her like a physical force, but she didn't react to it. She'd learned long ago that comfort was a luxury operators couldn't afford. She moved to the trunk, popped it open, and pulled out a large duffel bag that had traveled with her to more countries than most people visit in a lifetime. Inside that bag was her operational gear, a plate carrier customized over years of hard use, magazines loaded and ready, her rifle a Heckler & Koch .416 that she'd personally zeroed on 3 different continents. Every piece of equipment bore the marks of someone who understood that in combat your gear is the thin line between going home and going home in a box. She shouldered the bag with practiced ease and walked toward the main administrative building. Her gait was balanced, weight-centered, each step deliberate. To the untrained eye, she looked like any other soldier reporting for training. To someone who knew what to look for, she moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked Tier 1 operators. No wasted energy, no unnecessary movement, every action calculated and purposeful. The administrative building was a standard military structure. Cinder block walls painted institutional beige, linoleum floors polished to a dull shine by generations of enlisted personnel on cleaning duty, bulletin boards covered in official notices, training schedules, and safety reminders that everyone ignored. Behind the main desk sat a staff sergeant whose name tape read Morrison. He was working through a stack of paperwork with the resigned expression of a man who'd accepted that bureaucracy was the true enemy of military efficiency. "Help you, ma'am?" He didn't look up. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan, reporting for the advanced CQB course. She placed her orders on the desk. Standard transfer paperwork, everything properly stamped and signed. Morrison glanced at the papers, then at her, then back at the papers. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Navy?" "Yes, Sergeant." "We don't get many Navy personnel for this course. It's mostly Army and Marines. Some Air Force combat controllers occasionally." He was studying her now, trying to reconcile her small frame with the intensity of the training program she was about to enter. 5'6", maybe 140 pounds. She looked like she could be someone's younger sister, not someone who'd volunteered for one of the most physically demanding courses the military offered. "I'm aware," Sarah said. "Nothing more." Morrison handed back her orders. "Barracks are Building 7. You'll be bunking solo since you're the only female participant this cycle. Training starts 0600 tomorrow. The rest of the class is already here. They arrived yesterday." He paused. "Fair warning, ma'am. Captain Thornton runs a hard program. Physical intense. He doesn't pull punches." "Neither do I, Sergeant." Morrison's expression suggested he'd heard that before from soldiers who'd later dropped out. He gave her a building key and directions to the barracks. Sarah thanked him and left. She didn't notice the staff sergeant pick up his desk phone after she'd gone. Didn't hear him dial an internal extension. Didn't hear him say, "Captain Thornton, we've got our Navy participant. Just checked in, small woman quiet. Should be interesting." She didn't hear the laughter on the other end of the line. 3 floors above the administrative office, in the observation booth that overlooked the main training floor, Colonel Frank Hartwell stood with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on the monitor displaying the parking lot camera feed. He was 62 years old with iron gray hair cropped close to his skull and a face that looked like it had been carved from desert sandstone by wind and hard experience. He'd watched Sarah Brennan park her car, watched her sit in that precise stillness for 30 seconds, watched her breathing pattern through the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, watched the way she'd handled her gear bag with the casual competence of someone for whom violence was a profession, not a possibility. And he'd known with the certainty that comes from 3 decades of watching warriors prepare for battle exactly what she was. Frank Hartwell had joined the Marine Corps in 1983 when the Cold War was still cold and the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union. He'd served with Force Recon during the first Gulf War in 1991, running reconnaissance missions deep in Iraqi territory, living on adrenaline and bad coffee, while laser-guided bombs turned the night sky into something from a science fiction film. He'd been in Mogadishu in 1993 during the Battle of the Black Sea, though his unit's role remained classified even now. He'd seen what happened when poor leadership met overwhelming enemy force. He'd watched men die because their commanders had prioritized political optics over tactical reality. He'd carried those lessons forward through every command position he'd held since. Now, as the commander of the Joint Urban Warfare Training Center, he was responsible for training the next generation of close-quarters combat specialists. It was his job to ensure they were prepared for the brutal reality of urban warfare. It was his job to identify instructors who understood the difference between tough training and toxic leadership. And it was his job when the Joint Special Operations Command sent him an encrypted message 3 weeks ago to create the conditions for an evaluation that would determine whether Captain Wade Thornton was a hard-ass who pushed soldiers to excellence or a sadist who broke them for sport. The message had been brief. DevGru operator arriving for assessment. Cover role as standard Navy participant. Do not reveal identity. Do not intervene except in case of life-threatening situation. Document all interactions. Report directly to JSOC. Hartwell had agreed immediately. He'd been hearing rumors about Thornton for years. Complaints that never quite rose to the level of official reports. Students who'd graduated but carried injuries that hindered their later performance. A culture of intimidation wrapped in the language of toughness. But rumors weren't evidence, and in the military you couldn't remove an instructor based on whispers. So JSOC had sent someone to draw out the truth. Someone who could endure whatever Thornton dished out and survive long enough to document it. Someone whose presence would make Thornton reveal his true nature because he wouldn't be able to resist the target. They'd sent a sheepdog disguised as a sheep, and Hartwell was here to make sure the experiment ran its course. He pulled out a secure tablet and typed a brief message. Subject arrived. Protocol active. Will maintain observation. The reply came back in seconds, confirmed. She's one of our best. Whatever she endures, she does so voluntarily. Your job is to watch and record. Do not interfere unless absolutely necessary. Hartwell locked the tablet and returned his attention to the monitor. Sarah Brennan had emerged from the administrative building and was walking toward the barracks. Her stride was measured, unhurried. She didn't look around like a tourist taking in new surroundings. She navigated with the confidence of someone who'd spent years operating in unfamiliar territory. Colonel, a young lieutenant appeared at his elbow. The man's name was Peters, and he served as Hartwell's aide and administrative officer. The training roster is confirmed for tomorrow. 12 Rangers plus the Navy participant. Captain Thornton wants to begin with physical assessment and then move to live fire drills. Understood. Hartwell kept his eyes on the screen. Make sure all the observation cameras are operational. I want every training session recorded from multiple angles. Sir, that's standard practice anyway. I know it's standard, Lieutenant. I'm saying I want you to personally verify every camera is working. Check the backup systems too. I don't want any gaps in coverage. Peters looked puzzled but nodded. Yes, sir. Is there a particular reason for the extra scrutiny? Just being thorough. Hartwell's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Peters saluted and left. Hartwell remained at his post, watching the monitor until Sarah Brennan disappeared into the barracks building. Then he pulled up Captain Wade Thornton's personnel file on the tablet. The official record looked impressive. Multiple combat deployments. Ranger qualified. Excellent marks from previous training assignments. Letters of commendation. On paper, Thornton was exactly the kind of hard-charging infantry officer the Army needed. But Hartwell had been reading personnel files for 30 years, and he knew how to spot the gaps between the official narrative and the truth. Thornton had applied for SEAL training twice, failed both times. Not because he lacked physical ability, but because he couldn't handle the psychological pressure. The evaluation notes were diplomatic but clear. Candidate demonstrates difficulty accepting constructive criticism. Shows tendency toward aggressive responses when challenged. Recommend additional maturity before reapplication. That had been 14 years ago. Thornton never reapplied. Instead, he'd remained in the Army, moved into training roles, and built a reputation as a demanding instructor. Some called him tough but fair. Others used different words in private. And now he was about to spend 2 weeks training someone who had succeeded where he'd failed. Someone who wore the SEAL trident on her dress uniform. Someone who'd earned the Navy Cross for actions so classified that even Hartwell, with his security clearance, couldn't access the full details. Thornton didn't know who Sarah Brennan really was. He saw only a woman, a small woman, an outsider from a service branch he considered inferior to his beloved Rangers. He would see a target for all his accumulated frustration and insecurity. Hartwell closed the file and watched the sun track across the training facility. Tomorrow morning would be interesting. He'd been in the military long enough to recognize when two opposing forces were about to collide. The only question was which one would survive the impact. He had his suspicions, but suspicions weren't certainties, and in war, as in life, the only predictable thing was that nothing went according to plan. So he would watch, he would document, and when it was over, he would ensure that justice, that slow and grinding mechanism, finally caught up with men who abused their authority in the name of tradition. Sarah Brennan's assigned barracks room was Spartan, even by military standards. A single bed with a thin mattress, a metal locker, a desk and chair, a small window that looked out over the obstacle course. The walls were cinder block, painted institutional white. The floor was concrete covered with linoleum that had been scuffed by generations of boots. She set her duffel on the bed and began the ritual of unpacking her gear. Everything had its place. Everything was arranged for maximum efficiency. Her plate carrier hung on a wall hook where she could reach it in darkness. Her rifle, disassembled for travel, was laid out on the desk for cleaning and inspection. Magazines were stacked in precise rows, springs compressed just enough to maintain tension without causing fatigue. Her combat knife, a Benchmade Nimravus with a blackened blade, rested in its sheath on her belt. This was the liturgy of the warrior, the ceremonial preparation that transformed equipment into extensions of the body. Sarah had performed these rituals in forward operating bases in Afghanistan, in safe houses in Iraq, in training facilities across 3 continents. The locations changed. The ritual remained constant. When her gear was arranged to satisfaction, she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself 5 minutes of stillness. 5 minutes to feel the dull ache in her muscles from the long drive. 5 minutes to acknowledge the weight of what she was about to do. She was volunteering to be abused. That was the stark reality beneath all the tactical language and official justification. She was going to endure whatever Captain Wade Thornton chose to inflict, because that was the only way to document his behavior in a manner that would hold up to scrutiny. Video evidence, witness testimony, medical records if necessary, building a case brick by brick. Most people would ask why she was willing to suffer for a cause that wouldn't directly benefit her. She already had her SEAL trident. She'd already proven herself in combat more times than she could count. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But that was the point. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for the young women who would come after her. The ones who would face instructors like Thornton and wouldn't have the experience or the rank or the combat record to protect themselves. The ones who might endure the abuse and say nothing because they believed it was just part of the process. The ones who might develop chronic injuries that would get them killed years later in situations they should have survived. She was doing it for Rebecca Hayes, who died with Sarah's name on her lips and blood on her hands. The photograph was in her pocket now. She pulled it out, studied those 2 young faces grinning despite exhaustion and danger. Rebecca had always been the optimist. Even in the worst situations, she'd found something to laugh about. Some absurd detail that made the chaos bearable. During their first deployment together, pinned down by enemy fire in a compound that smelled like burning tires and human waste, Rebecca had looked over at Sarah and said, "You know what, I'm craving pancakes, like a whole stack, with that fake maple syrup that comes in the tiny packets." And somehow, impossibly, that had made Sarah laugh even as bullets chewed the wall above their heads. Rebecca would have understood why Sarah was here. She would have approved. She might have even volunteered herself if their positions were reversed. Sarah placed the photograph on the desk propped against the wall where she could see it. A reminder, a talisman, a promise. 3 more days, she thought. Just 3 more days of whatever he dishes out, and then I'll show him what a real warrior looks like. She lay back on the thin mattress, closed her eyes, and began the mental preparation that was as important as any physical training. She visualized the scenario she might face. Visualized maintaining her calm regardless of what Thornton said or did. Visualized the moment when everything would become clear, when the truth would emerge from beneath the layers of pretense. She fell asleep with her boots still on, the way she'd learned to sleep in combat zones where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Her breathing remained slow and measured even in sleep. Her hands resting at her sides bore the calluses of someone who'd spent years gripping a rifle in conditions that would break most people's resolve. Tomorrow the test would begin. But tonight she rested. Because warriors understand that rest is a weapon too, and you don't go into battle exhausted unless you have no other choice. In 3 days, Captain Wade Thornton's world would end. He just didn't know it yet. The sun rose over Fort Bragg at 0545, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and blood orange. Sarah Brennan was already awake, dressed in her training fatigues, lacing her boots with the methodical precision of someone performing a ritual they'd completed thousands of times. She'd been awake since 0400, a habit carved into her circadian rhythm by years of pre-dawn operations. Her body knew that darkness before dawn was when violence most often came calling. She arrived at the training area at 0550, 10 minutes early. The concrete pad stretched before her like a stage awaiting its performers. Kill house structures loomed in the background, their facades pockmarked with years of simulated combat. Beyond them, shooting ranges stretched toward tree lines that marked the facility's boundaries. 12 men were already present, clustered in loose groups of 2 or 3. Army Rangers, their unit patches visible on their shoulders. They ranged in age from mid-20s to late 30s, all bearing the weathered confidence of soldiers who'd seen combat and survived to tell the tale. Their conversation died as Sarah approached. 12 pairs of eyes tracked her movement across the concrete. She didn't acknowledge the stares. She simply found a space at the edge of the formation and began her warm-up routine. Arm circles, leg swings, dynamic stretches that kept her muscles loose and ready. She'd learned long ago that the body was a machine that required proper preparation, and cold muscles were how operators ended up injured before the real work even began. Well, well, the voice cut through the morning air with the false joviality of a bully who'd just spotted prey. Look what the Navy dragged in. Captain Wade Thornton strode onto the training pad like a man who owned not just the space, but everyone standing on it. He was 6'2", 210 pounds of muscle, and attitude with blonde hair cropped in a high and tight that made his head look like a battering ram. His face was broad and reddening already from the morning heat, and his eyes held the particular gleam of someone who enjoyed their authority a little too much. Behind him walked 2 assistant instructors, both sergeants who'd clearly learned that their job was to laugh at Thornton's jokes and nod at his proclamations. They took up positions flanking him, creating a triangle of authority that faced the assembled students. Gentlemen, Thornton's voice boomed across the training area. Welcome to Week 2 of the Advanced CQB course. For those of you who survived Week 1, congratulations. You've proven you can handle the basics. This week we separate the warriors from the tourists. His eyes found Sarah and stayed there. And speaking of tourists, it appears the Navy has decided to join us. How generous of them to send their very best. A few of the Rangers chuckled. Nervous laughter, the kind that comes from men who aren't sure if they're supposed to find something funny, but know that their instructor expects it. Sarah maintained her stretching routine. Her face showed nothing. No irritation, no embarrassment, no acknowledgement that she'd even heard the comment. This was the first test, and it had nothing to do with physical ability. It was about whether she could be provoked into an emotional response. Thornton's smile faltered slightly at her lack of reaction. He'd been expecting something. Anger, defensiveness, even a forced smile. The complete absence of any response was somehow more frustrating than resistance would have been. Line up, he barked. Height order, tallest to shortest. Let's see what we're working with. The soldiers arranged themselves quickly, muscle memory taking over. Sarah ended up at the far right of the formation, the shortest person present by 3 inches. It was a deliberate arrangement, and everyone knew it. The message was clear: you don't belong here, and even your body knows it. From his vantage point in the observation booth, 3 stories above, Colonel Hartwell watched through the tinted glass. His face was impassive, but his hands gripped the railing with enough force to blanch his knuckles white. Next to him, Lieutenant Peters stood with a tablet ready to take notes. "Recording?" Hartwell asked. "Yes, sir. All 6 cameras operational. Audio is clear." "Good. I want every word documented." On the training pad below, Thornton began his opening monologue. It was a speech he'd clearly given many times, refined through repetition until it flowed with practiced ease. "Close quarters battle," he said, pacing in front of the formation like a preacher before his congregation, "is the most intimate form of warfare. You're not launching missiles from ships. You're not calling in airstrikes from a comfortable distance. You're face to face with the enemy, close enough to smell their last meal, close enough to see the fear in their eyes when they realize they're about to die. This is where wars are actually won. In rooms, in hallways, in the brutal, bloody spaces where hesitation gets you killed and aggression keeps you breathing." He stopped pacing and turned to face them directly. "This week, I'm going to push you harder than you've ever been pushed. I'm going to put you in situations that simulate real combat stress. Some of you will rise to the challenge. Some of you will wash out, and that's fine. Better to discover your limits here, where the bullets are fake, than downrange where they're very, very real." His eyes found Sarah again. "Of course, some of you might be wondering why we're wasting time on someone who will never see real combat. After all the Navy's idea of close quarters battle, they're probably deciding which fork to use at the officer's mess." More laughter from the Rangers, louder this time because Thornton had given them explicit permission. Sarah continued staring straight ahead. Her breathing remained controlled. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. "But I'm generous," Thornton continued. "I believe in equal opportunity. If the Navy wants to send someone to learn how real warriors operate, who am I to deny them? So let's start with something simple. Physical assessment. I want to see what kind of shape you people are in." He pointed to a pull-up bar mounted between 2 posts at the edge of the training pad. "Max effort pull-ups, dead hang chin over bar, full extension at the bottom. We'll go in reverse order." He smiled at Sarah. "Ladies first." The other Rangers shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't standard protocol. Usually physical assessments happened alphabetically or by volunteer, but no one was going to challenge the instructor on day 1. Sarah walked to the pull-up bar without hesitation. She reached up, gripped the cold metal, and hung for a moment with her full weight suspended. Her frame looked small beneath the bar, almost childlike compared to the men who would follow her. Then she began. The first 10 came smooth and controlled, chin clearing the bar by 2 inches, arms extending fully at the bottom. No kipping, no momentum, just pure strength pulled from muscles that had been forged through years of training that made this course look like a vacation. At 15, some of the Rangers began to pay closer attention. At 20, they'd stop their side conversations entirely. At 25, even Thornton's smirk had faded into something more focused. Sarah didn't stop at 25. She continued with the same mechanical precision, her breathing still controlled, her form still perfect. 30, 35, 40. The only sign of strain was a slight tremor in her forearms and the sheen of sweat forming on her forehead. At 50, she dropped from the bar and stood at attention. Her chest was rising and falling more rapidly now, but she wasn't gasping. She wasn't bent over. She simply stood there waiting for the next instruction, as if completing 50 perfect pull-ups was as routine as brushing her teeth. The silence on the training pad was absolute. 50 pull-ups was exceptional by any standard. The Army Ranger physical fitness test required 19 for a perfect score. Sarah had just done nearly 3 times that number without apparent difficulty. Thornton's face had gone from red to a deeper shade of crimson. He'd meant to embarrass her, to establish dominance by making her fail at the first task. Instead, she just demonstrated a level of physical capability that exceeded most of the men present. "Not bad," he said finally, his voice tight. "For someone who spends most of their time on a boat. Let's see how you do with something that actually matters." The rest of the morning devolved into a carefully orchestrated campaign of escalating challenges. Thornton assigned Sarah to every difficult task he could contrive. carrying 90-pound ammo cans across the obstacle course while the other rangers carried 60. Running sprints with a gas mask on while everyone else ran without. Holding plank position for times that stretched well beyond standard training protocols. She completed every task without complaint, without comment, without any visible sign that she was being singled out for treatment that bordered on hazing. The other rangers noticed. They weren't stupid, but they also weren't going to risk Thornton's wrath by speaking up for someone they barely knew. Except one. Staff Sergeant Marcus Dalton was 34 years old, a veteran of 6 deployments split between Iraq and Afghanistan. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent too many years in the sun and dust, and his eyes held a particular weariness that comes from seeing things that can't be unseen. He was also one of the few rangers in the course who'd worked alongside SEAL teams during joint operations. He recognized quality when he saw it, and Sarah's performance was screaming quality in a language only the experienced could understand. During the midday water break, as Thornton was berating another student for some minor infraction, Dalton moved next to Sarah at the water station. "Ma'am," he said quietly, filling his canteen, "you don't have to prove anything to these people." Sarah didn't look at him. She was focused on hydrating, drinking in measured sips rather than gulps. "I'm not trying to prove anything, Sergeant. I'm just here to train." "With respect, ma'am, that's horse shit." Dalton kept his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. "I've worked with SEALs before. I know the difference between regular Navy and special operations. And I know when an instructor is targeting someone for personal reasons rather than professional ones." Now Sarah did glance at him, just a brief flicker of eye contact, but enough to assess whether he was genuine or setting a trap. She saw only concern in his expression, concern and a kind of resigned anger that suggested he'd seen this pattern before and hadn't liked it then either. "I appreciate your observations, Sergeant," she said, "but I can handle Captain Thornton." "I'm sure you can, ma'am. I'm just saying, if things escalate, there are people here who'll back your testimony. You don't have to endure abuse in silence." Sarah capped her canteen and turned to face him fully. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Not yet, Sergeant, but thank you." Before Dalton could respond, Thornton's voice cut across the training area. "Water breaks over, back to work, and Dalton, since you're so interested in chatting, you and our Navy princess can partner up for hand-to-hand drills. Let's see if she can handle a real opponent." The afternoon session focused on combatives, the Army's term for hand-to-hand combat training. The students paired off on foam mats spread across the concrete, practicing takedowns and submission holds under Thornton's supervision. Dalton and Sarah faced each other on their assigned mat. He was 8 inches taller and 70 pounds heavier. The size disparity was obvious to everyone watching. "Don't go easy on her, Dalton," Thornton called out, circling their mat like a shark who'd scented blood. "She wants to play with the big boys. She needs to learn how the big boys play." Dalton looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm going to follow the instructor's guidance, but I'll try to—" "It's fine, Sergeant," Sarah interrupted. "Use your full strength. I need the practice." They began the drill. Dalton came in for a standard collar tie, the opening move for most wrestling exchanges. Sarah slipped it smoothly, transitioning to an arm drag that would have taken Dalton to the ground if he hadn't been expecting resistance. They reset and went again. For the next 20 minutes, they worked through various scenarios. Each time, Sarah demonstrated a level of technical skill that clearly surprised Dalton. She wasn't overpowering him with strength. She was using leverage, timing, and technique to compensate for the size difference. It was the kind of refined skill set that came from years of grappling with opponents who were bigger, stronger, and trying very hard to hurt you. Thornton watched with increasing irritation. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. Sarah was supposed to be getting dominated, embarrassed, made to feel inadequate. Instead, she was holding her own against a decorated ranger with significant combat experience. "Hold up," Thornton commanded. The training stopped. All eyes turned to him. "I don't think we're creating enough realism here. Dalton, you are being too gentle. In real combat, the enemy isn't going to worry about hurting you." He stepped onto the mat. "Let me demonstrate the proper intensity." What happened next would be captured on 6 different camera angles in high-definition video. It would later be analyzed frame by frame by military lawyers, behavioral psychologists, and a board of inquiry that would describe it with clinical precision as a clear violation of Article 93 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Cruelty, and Maltreatment. But in the moment as it unfolded, it was simply brutal. Thornton positioned himself behind Sarah. "This is a standard rear takedown scenario," he announced to the class. "Your opponent has achieved back control. Most people panic. They try to turn into the attacker, which is exactly wrong. Let me show you what happens when you make that mistake." He wrapped his right arm around Sarah's neck in a crude chokehold. Not a proper blood choke that would render someone unconscious safely, but a trachea-crushing grip that restricted air rather than blood flow. Sarah's training told her immediately that this was wrong, that Thornton either didn't know what he was doing or didn't care. Her hands came up instinctively to relieve the pressure. "See how she's fighting?" Thornton's voice remained conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than slowly strangling a fellow officer. "That's wasted energy. In a real situation, you need to accept the dominant position and work from there." He increased the pressure. Sarah's face began to redden. Her fingers clawed at his forearm, but he was too strong, his grip too tight. The other Rangers shifted uncomfortably. This had crossed the line from demonstration to something darker. Then Thornton swept Sarah's legs and drove her face first into the mat. Her body hit hard enough that the impact was audible, a sound like meat slapping against butcher's paper. Before she could recover, Thornton dropped his full weight onto her back, driving his right knee into the base of her skull with precisely calculated force. 187 pounds of pressure concentrated on the most vulnerable part of the cervical spine. Sarah's vision went white with pain. The pressure was immense, crushing, threatening to fracture the C2 vertebra that protected her spinal cord. If it snapped, she would be paralyzed from the neck down. If it displaced, she could die before anyone could get her to a hospital. The danger was immediate and real. She didn't scream. The sound that might have escaped was trapped by the angle of her neck and the weight crushing her vocal cords. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only endure as Thornton held her there for 8 seconds. That felt like 8 hours. "This is how you neutralize a threat," Thornton said to the assembled students, his voice calm and professional, as if he weren't currently committing assault. "Complete domination of position. They can't move, can't breathe, can't resist. This is the reality of close quarters combat." He ground his knee one final time against her skull, a gratuitous twist of cruelty that had nothing to do with demonstration and everything to do with establishing dominance. Then he stood releasing her with theatrical casualness. Sarah lay motionless for 3 seconds. The watching Rangers held their collective breath. Dalton had started forward, his face a mask of outrage, but one of Thornton's assistant instructors blocked his path with a subtle shake of the head. "Don't make it worse." Then Sarah moved. She didn't use her hands to push herself up. She didn't roll to her side and struggle to her knees. She simply stood in one fluid motion, as if gravity had suddenly reversed itself and pulled her upright. Her face was flushed red from the pressure and lack of oxygen. A thin line of blood trickled from her left nostril where the impact with the mat had been hardest. She stood at attention. Her hands came up and patted her uniform twice. Left shoulder, right shoulder, removing invisible dust from fabric that was already immaculate. The gesture was mechanical, precise, utterly emotionless. Then she looked at Captain Wade Thornton with eyes that held all the warmth of the North Atlantic in February. "Is the demonstration complete, Captain?" Her voice was flat, professional. The tone hadn't changed from when she'd asked for directions to the barracks the day before. There was no anger in it, no pain, no fear, just a simple question posed in the same manner someone might ask about the weather forecast. The effect on Thornton was immediate and visceral. He'd been expecting tears, anger, some kind of emotional reaction that would justify his actions, that would allow him to frame her response as weakness unsuited for combat roles. Instead, she'd given him nothing. Not a single crack in the facade, not a single indication that what he'd just done had affected her in any way whatsoever. It was unnerving in a way that resistance would never have been. Her complete lack of reaction suggested either inhuman self-control or the kind of psychological conditioning that came from experiences far more traumatic than anything Thornton could imagine inflicting. "Get out of my sight," he said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "Go clean yourself up. You're bleeding on my training mat." Sarah touched her upper lip, saw the blood on her fingers, and nodded once. "Yes, sir." She walked toward the barracks with the same measured stride she'd used all day. No limping, no rubbing her neck where the crushing pressure had been applied. No indication whatsoever that she'd just been subjected to what any reasonable person would classify as assault. The moment she was out of sight, the tension on the training pad exploded. "What the hell was that?" Dalton's voice was low but furious. He'd moved to stand directly in front of Thornton, his body language suggesting he was very close to doing something that would end his career. "Sir, that wasn't a demonstration. That was, that was realistic training, Sergeant," Thornton interrupted. His face was still red, but now it was the red of anger rather than exertion. "Something you'd understand if you'd spent less time holding hands with enemy prisoners and more time learning how to break them. This is how combat works. It's not gentle. It's not fair. And if she can't handle a controlled demonstration, she has no business being here." "Controlled?" Another ranger spoke up, a younger specialist whose name tag read Collins. "Sir, you could have broken her neck. The pressure you applied. Are you questioning my judgment, specialist?" Collins went quiet. The threat in Thornton's voice was unmistakable. "Question this instructor and face consequences that would follow you for the rest of your career." "I didn't think so," Thornton said. "Now everyone drop and give me 50 push-ups for wasting my time with complaints. And while you're counting, think about whether you want to be warriors or daycare attendants. Because in my course, we train warriors." The Rangers dropped to the mat and began their push-ups. Dalton held Thornton's gaze for one more second before complying. His jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. 3 stories above in the observation booth, Colonel Hartwell watched the playback of what had just happened. He'd seen it live, but he needed to watch it again to ensure he wasn't allowing his anger to cloud his assessment of events. "Lieutenant Peters," he said quietly. "Sir, copy that footage to secure storage. 3 separate locations. I want redundancy that would survive a nuclear strike." "Yes, sir." Peters was pale. He'd seen combat, but watching an instructor deliberately hurt a student in the name of training had shaken him. "Sir, shouldn't we intervene? What he did was—" "I know exactly what it was, Lieutenant." Hartwell's voice was colder than Peters had ever heard it. "But our orders are to observe and document unless there's immediate life-threatening danger. She's walking. She's conscious. Medically, she'll survive." He paused. "But Thornton won't survive what's coming. That video just ended his career. He's too stupid to know it yet." Peters nodded and began the process of securing the footage. Hartwell remained at the window watching the training pad below where 12 Rangers were counting out push-ups while their instructor looked on with satisfaction. Somewhere in the back of Hartwell's mind, a memory surfaced. Mogadishu, 1993. Watching a helicopter fall from the sky in a plume of smoke and fire. Watching men die because their leadership had prioritized pride over tactical reality. Watching the consequences of arrogance play out in real time with body bags as the final scoreboard. He'd sworn then that if he ever achieved command authority, he would never allow pride to supersede sound judgment. He would never allow leaders to abuse their soldiers in the name of toughness. He would never stand by while good people were broken by bad leadership. Today he was keeping that promise, even if it meant watching someone suffer in the short term to prevent countless others from suffering in the long term. 3 more days, he muttered. Just 3 more days, and this all becomes evidence. On the training pad, Thornton dismissed the class. The Rangers scattered toward the barracks, their conversations subdued. Only Dalton lingered, staring at the spot where Sarah had been driven into the mat with enough force to kill. He pulled out his phone and typed a careful message to an old contact, someone he'd served with during his last deployment. A Navy Master Chief who'd told him years ago that if he ever saw anything that needed attention from people who could actually fix problems rather than just write reports, he should reach out. The message read, "Need to talk, training situation. Urgent." The reply came back in less than a minute. Encrypted line, 20 minutes. Dalton nodded to himself and walked toward the barracks. He didn't know the full story of who Sarah Brennan really was, but he knew injustice when he saw it, and he'd seen enough in his career to understand that sometimes the official channels were too slow to prevent real damage. Sometimes you needed to reach outside the chain of command to people who could make things happen. In her barracks room, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed and carefully probed her neck with trained fingers. The C2 vertebra was intact. Bruised probably, and she'd have significant soft tissue damage that would make turning her head painful for days. But nothing was broken, nothing was displaced. She would heal. She pulled the photograph from her pocket. Rebecca Hayes smiled at her from 9 years in the past, frozen in a moment before pain and hesitation and death had claimed her. 2 more days, Sarah whispered. Just 2 more days, Becca. Then he'll understand what he's created. Then he'll know what it is. She placed the photo on the desk and lay back on the thin mattress. Her body was a map of pain, each bruise and strain a marker of the violence Thornton had inflicted. But pain was temporary. Justice was permanent. And in 48 hours, she would demonstrate the difference between someone who talked about being a warrior and someone who actually was one. The sun set over Fort Bragg, painting the kill houses in shades of orange and shadow. Tomorrow would bring the more abuse and more demonstrations of Thornton's insecurity masked as training. But after tomorrow came the final test, the culminating exercise where everything would become clear. Sarah closed her eyes and began the mental preparation, visualizing the kill house layout, calculating angles and entry points, preparing for the moment when silence would finally speak louder than any words ever could. In 72 hours, Captain Wade Thornton's career would be over. But first, he would learn exactly what he'd spent 3 days trying to break. He would learn what a real warrior looked like when the performance was over and the actual work began. The morning of the fourth day arrived with a kind of oppressive humidity that made breathing feel like drinking hot soup. Sarah Brennan stood in front of the small mirror mounted above her sink, examining the damage from 3 days of Captain Wade Thornton's particular brand of instruction. The bruising on her back had bloomed into a spectacular canvas of purple and yellow spreading from the base of her skull down to her shoulder blades. Her ribs on the left side showed the greenish tinge of healing contusions. A small cut above her eyebrow had scabbed over. She cataloged each injury with clinical detachment. Pain was information. Information was power. And she had gathered enough information over the past 72 hours to end a man's career and potentially his freedom. The recording device sewn into the lining of her plate carrier had captured everything. Every insult, every deliberately excessive physical contact, every moment when Thornton had crossed the line from demanding instructor to abusive tyrant. The footage was encrypted and uploading automatically to secure JSOC servers every night. Even if Thornton somehow discovered the device and destroyed it, the evidence was already beyond his reach. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Sarah had learned through years of watching toxic leaders escape consequences that documentation without context was just data. You needed a moment, a crystallizing event so undeniable that even the most dedicated apologists couldn't explain it away. You needed to give them enough rope to hang themselves in a manner so public and spectacular that the institution had no choice but to act. Today was that moment. She dressed slowly, each movement measured to minimize the pain from her injuries. Standard training fatigues, boots laced tight, her plate carrier adjusted and rechecked 3 times. Her HK-416 rifle cleaned and functions checked until it gleamed. And finally, her magazines. She loaded each one personally, counting rounds with precision. 14 rounds per magazine, not the standard 19. A deliberate handicap that would make what she was about to do even more impossible to dismiss as luck. At 0530, she stepped out of the barracks into air that already felt thick enough to chew. The sky was the color of dirty concrete, promising rain that would probably never come. She walked toward the briefing room where Thornton would lay out the final exercise, the culminating event that would supposedly separate the warriors from the pretenders. The 12 Rangers were already assembled when she arrived. They looked at her differently now. 3 days of watching her endure abuse that would have broken most soldiers had earned their respect, even if they wouldn't voice it while Thornton was watching. Staff Sergeant Dalton caught her eye and gave a subtle nod. His expression suggested he knew something, though Sarah couldn't imagine what. She hadn't told anyone about her true identity or the nature of her mission. Captain Thornton entered at 0600, precisely flanked by his 2 assistant instructors. He looked pleased with himself the way a cat looks pleased after cornering a mouse. He'd spent 3 days breaking down the Navy girl, and now he would finish the job with a final humiliation so complete that she'd have no choice but to quit or fail spectacularly. Gentlemen, he began, deliberately excluding Sarah from the address, today is your final test. Everything you have learned over the past 2 weeks culminates in this exercise. Full-scale hostage rescue simulation in Kill House 4. He gestured to a large monitor displaying a 3D schematic of the facility. 12 rooms, 3 floors, multiple fatal funnels and choke points. 11 hostile role players armed with simunition rounds. The Rangers leaned forward, studying the layout. Simunition rounds were marking cartridges that hit with the force of a hard punch and left painful welts. They added a visceral layer of consequence to training that blank rounds couldn't replicate. Getting shot hurt. Getting shot multiple times could leave you injured enough to need medical attention. Average completion time for this scenario, Thornton continued, is 4 minutes and 23 seconds. The facility record is held by a Delta Force team of 6 operators who completed it in 2 minutes and 47 seconds. He paused for effect. That's the standard you're chasing. He turned to the roster on his tablet, his finger scrolling with deliberate slowness. Now for team assignments. Bravo team will run first, followed by Charlie team. But for Alpha team, the most critical element, I need someone on point. The point position in a breach was the most dangerous and demanding role. First through every door, first to encounter every threat, first to make the split-second decisions that would cascade through the entire team. It required exceptional situational awareness, aggression, and the ability to process information faster than conscious thought could manage. Most instructors assign their best operators to point. Thornton had other plans. His eyes found Sarah with predatory precision. Petty Officer Brennan, your Alpha team point. Let's see what the Navy taught you about being at the sharp end of the spear. The room went silent. Every Ranger understood what had just happened. This wasn't an assignment. It was a setup. Thornton was putting Sarah in a position where failure was almost guaranteed, and that failure would be public recorded and used as evidence that women didn't belong in combat roles. Her inevitable mistakes would bog down the team, resulting in a failed mission that Thornton could point to for years as proof of his theories about female operators. Sarah stood. Understood, Captain. Her voice betrayed nothing. No fear, no hesitation, no recognition of the trap being set. I have one request. Thornton's smile widened. Here it comes, his expression said. The excuse, the plea for a different assignment. The admission that she wasn't ready. What's that? Permission to run the course solo. No team. The words hung in the air like smoke from a detonated charge. The Rangers stared. The assistant instructors exchanged glances. Even Thornton's smile faltered for a moment before returning with renewed viciousness. Solo? He made the words sound absurd. You want to run a 12-room hostage rescue scenario designed for a 6-man team by yourself? Yes, sir. Thornton laughed. It was a genuine sound, unforced and delighted. This was better than he'd planned. She wasn't just going to fail. She was going to fail so catastrophically that it would become legendary. Granted, you want to embarrass yourself alone, be my guest. Course starts at 0800. Don't be late. He dismissed the briefing. The Rangers filed out, several of them glancing back at Sarah with expressions that ranged from pity to morbid curiosity. Dalton lingered at the door until Thornton shot him a look that sent him moving. Sarah remained seated, studying the kill house schematic on the monitor. She committed every detail to memory: room layouts, door positions, likely hostile placements, based on standard training protocols. She was building a 3-dimensional map in her mind, the way a chess master might memorize a board position. In the observation booth, Colonel Frank Hartwell was already present, having arrived at 0500 to ensure all systems were operational. The room was more crowded than usual. 3 generals had arrived overnight, traveling under security protocols that suggested their presence was both important and classified. They stood at the back of the booth, speaking in low tones while Hartwell coordinated with his technical staff. All cameras operational, Hartwell asked Lieutenant Peters. Yes, sir. 6 angles, high-definition, redundant recording. Audio is crystal clear. Good. Hartwell turned to the generals. Gentlemen, what you're about to witness is the culmination of a JSOC evaluation that's been running for 72 hours. The operator you'll see is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan Devgrew. Her official cover is that she's a standard Navy participant in the course. Captain Thornton is unaware of her true identity or capabilities. The senior general, a 3-star named Patterson, who'd spent his career in special operations, nodded. We've reviewed the footage from the past 3 days, Colonel. What Thornton did to her yesterday was grounds for court-martial. Why didn't you intervene? Because she asked me not to, sir. Hartwell pulled up a secure message on his tablet and handed it to Patterson. This came through encrypted channels 18 hours ago. The message was brief: do not intervene regardless of circumstances. Need him to commit fully before revelation. Trust me. It was signed with the authentication codes that confirmed it had come from Sarah herself. Patterson handed the tablet back. She endured that deliberately to build an airtight case. Yes, sir. And in approximately 90 minutes, she's going to demonstrate exactly what Thornton tried to break. Hartwell's expression was grim. What you're about to see isn't standard. It's going to look impossible. But I've reviewed her service record. What she's planning is well within her documented capabilities. Down on the training floor, Sarah finished her equipment check. Every magazine seated properly, every strap adjusted. She performed a functions check on her rifle, cycling the action 5 times to ensure smooth operation. Then she moved to the staging area outside Kill House 4 and began the final mental preparation. She closed her eyes and visualized the entire run. Entry points, target priorities, movement patterns. She saw it all play out in her mind with perfect clarity, a choreographed dance of violence that would last less than a minute, but would require every ounce of skill she'd accumulated over 11 deployments in countless training iterations. She thought about Rebecca Hayes, about that moment in Ramadi when her mentor had hesitated for 0.4 seconds, about the funeral where Sarah had held Rebecca's 6-year-old daughter and promised that her mother's death would mean something, about 3 days of Thornton's abuse endured in silence because some battles required you to take damage before you could deliver justice. At 07:55, Captain Thornton arrived at the observation booth. He settled into a chair with the satisfied air of someone about to watch entertainment they'd been anticipating. He pulled out his tablet to monitor the exercise from multiple camera angles. "This should be interesting," he said to no one in particular. "I give her 30 seconds before she's overwhelmed." Colonel Hartwell said nothing. He simply watched the monitor showing Sarah in the staging area. She was standing perfectly still. Her breathing controlled her focus absolute. She looked like a statue carved from marble, beautiful and cold, and utterly unmoved by the world around her. At 0800 precisely, Thornton's voice crackled over the loudspeaker system. "Kill House 4 is live. 11 hostile role players are in position. 4 civilian role players as hostages. Your mission is to rescue the hostages and neutralize all threats. Simunition rounds are active. Rules of engagement are standard. Minimize friendly casualties. Avoid civilian casualties. Complete the mission." He paused, his voice dripping with false encouragement. "Ready, Brennan? Try not to embarrass the Navy too badly." Sarah's response came back calm and measured. "Captain, what's the facility record again?" Thornton's smile widened. 2 minutes 47 seconds. Delta Force Team, 6 operators. "Why?" "Just curious, sir. Ready to begin." In the observation booth, General Patterson leaned forward. "Colonel, what's she planning?" "Watch, sir," Hartwell said quietly. "Just watch." The breacher placed the explosive charge on the kill house door. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The explosion was a deafening crack that shook the entire structure. The heavy steel door buckled inward, smoke pouring from its mangled frame in a thick gray cloud that obscured everything beyond the threshold. Standard protocol dictated waiting for the smoke to clear before entry. Visibility was crucial. Moving through smoke was how operators got killed by friendly fire or walked into ambushes they couldn't see coming. Sarah didn't wait. She passed through the doorway before the smoke had even begun to dissipate, a ghost slipping through the veil between worlds. The first hostile positioned just inside the door in the fatal funnel, where he could mow down any entry team, had his rifle raised and ready. He was tracking the doorway, waiting for targets to present themselves in the smoke. He never fired a shot. 2 red paint splatters appeared on his chest in a grouping tight enough to cover with a playing card. A perfect double tap. The hostile's mouth opened in surprise, but before he could process what had happened, Sarah was already past him, flowing into the first room like water finding its path. In the observation booth, every person was standing now, pressed against the glass, or staring at monitors in stunned disbelief. "Jesus Christ," Lieutenant Peters whispered. "She entered through the smoke. How did she see?" "She didn't see," Hartwell interrupted. "She memorized the layout from the briefing and used thermal differential to navigate. That's advanced DevGru technique. Most operators never master it." On the monitor, Sarah was moving through the kill house with a speed that seemed to defy physics. The second hostile peered around a corner in the hallway. Before he could acquire a target, two more red splatters appeared on his helmet. The paint splashed across his face shield, and he dropped to his knees in the universal signal that he was out of the fight. Sarah cleared the corner without breaking stride, her rifle up, her movements impossibly fluid. She wasn't running. She was flowing each motion, transitioning seamlessly into the next like a dancer who'd rehearsed the choreography 10,000 times. Room 2 contained two hostiles using a desk for cover. Standard doctrine dictated engaging from the doorway using the frame for concealment while suppressing the enemy position. Sarah didn't follow standard doctrine. She rolled right immediately after crossing the threshold, coming at the hostiles from an oblique angle they hadn't anticipated. 4 shots. Pop, 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 pop. Both hostiles went down before they'd finished turning to face the threat. The timer on the main display read 8 seconds. "This isn't possible," Thornton muttered. His tablet showed Sarah's movement path as a glowing blue line that cut through the kill house with geometric precision. There were no hesitations, no backtracking, no wasted motion. It was a straight line from entry to objective, as if she could see through walls. "It's very possible," General Patterson said. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd commanded special operations forces for 2 decades and recognized mastery when he saw it. "She's not clearing rooms. She's dissecting them. That's the difference between good and exceptional." Room 5 presented the first real challenge. The scenario designers had placed it specifically to test operator judgment under stress. 2 hostile role players, 3 civilian role players. One of the hostiles was using a petite female civilian as a human shield, a simulated pistol pressed to her head. Partial concealment behind a door frame. Low light conditions. 23 feet of distance. Standard protocol dictated negotiation or waiting for sniper support. Taking the shot was considered too risky. The margin for error was microscopic. A miss would kill the hostage. Even a near miss might cause the hostile to reflexively pull the trigger. Sarah entered the room, assessed the situation in the time it takes to blink, and made her decision. She shifted her rifle to her left hand, her non-dominant hand, because the angle was better from that side. 23 feet, one hostile, partial concealment holding a hostage. Heart rate elevated from combat stress. Adrenaline flooding her system. Every factor working against accuracy. She fired once. The paint splatter appeared on the hostile's forehead, a perfect circle of red that marked the instant shutdown of the brainstem. The T-box shot, the most difficult precision technique in close quarters combat. The hostile's head snapped back. The civilian role player remained untouched, frozen in shock at what she just witnessed. In the observation booth, the silence was absolute. General Patterson's mouth had actually fallen open. Lieutenant Peters had stopped taking notes, his pen hovering above the tablet as his brain struggled to process what his eyes had just seen. "Did she just," one of the other generals began. "Left-handed precision shot under stress at 23 feet, Hartwell confirmed. "Targeting the medulla oblongata for instant neural shutdown. That's not luck, gentlemen. That's thousands of hours of training in scenarios most of us can't imagine." On Thornton's tablet, a system alert flashed. He stared at it, his face draining of color. "The rifle sensors are showing she only loaded 14 rounds per magazine. She handicapped herself." "Why would she do that?" Peters asked. "To prove a point," Hartwell said. "To ensure no one could claim she succeeded because of ideal conditions or equipment advantage. She's building a case so airtight that even the most dedicated skeptic can't poke holes in it." Sarah continued her assault through the remaining rooms. Each one presented challenges designed to slow down and frustrate even elite operators. Hostiles in elevated positions. Ambush points with overlapping fields of fire. Civilians scattered throughout to force target discrimination. Environmental factors like low light and acoustic confusion. She moved through them all like smoke through a screen door. 32 seconds, 35, 40. The hostile role players, many of whom were experienced soldiers themselves, later reported that they never saw her coming. They would hear a sound begin to turn and find paint splatters appearing on their bodies before they could complete the movement. Several described the experience as fighting a ghost. The final room contained the last hostile. He was a retired Master Chief named Daniel Cross, who'd served with DevGru for 15 years before moving into instructor roles. He'd been briefed that this scenario involved an evaluation, but he didn't know the specifics. His job was to provide maximum resistance within training safety parameters. Cross had positioned himself in a location that wasn't on the standard floor plan. He was in the ceiling tiles using a technique that most operators never considered because it required significant upper body strength to maintain the position silently. When Sarah entered the room, he was above and behind her, a perfect ambush position. But Sarah had detected him through acoustic signature. The subtle sound of his breathing in the enclosed space, the micro-movements of someone trying to remain perfectly still. She fired a blind shot through the ceiling tiles based purely on sound triangulation. Paint splattered across Cross's face. He dropped from the ceiling with a huge grin, mouthing words that the cameras later revealed, "That's my girl." The all-clear tone blared through the facility. The timer froze at 47 seconds. 47 seconds to complete a mission designed for a six-man team operating over 4 minutes. 47 seconds to neutralize 11 hostiles, rescue 4 hostages, and navigate a complex 3-story structure with 0 mistakes. The facility record of 2 minutes 47 seconds hadn't just been broken. It had been demolished so thoroughly that the previous record now looked like it had been set by amateurs. In the observation booth, General Patterson turned to Hartwell. "Colonel, in my 35 years in special operations, I have never witnessed anything like what I just saw. That wasn't training. That was art." The other generals were nodding their faces, showing the kind of awe that experienced warriors reserve for moments that redefine their understanding of what's possible. Even the junior officers and enlisted technical staff were staring at the monitors as if they'd just witnessed a miracle. Only Captain Wade Thornton seemed unable to process what had happened. He was staring at his tablet, watching the replay of Sarah's movement path through the kill house. The blue line cut through the structure with such precision that it looked like a computer simulation rather than actual human movement. The statistics displayed alongside the path were equally impossible. 100% accuracy, 14 shots fired, 11 hostiles, neutralized 0 civilian casualties, 0 friendly fire incidents. "The sensors malfunction," he said. His voice was hollow. "That's the only explanation. Run the diagnostics. Check the timing system. This isn't possible. No one can clear 12 rooms in 47 seconds. No one." "The sensors are working perfectly, Captain," Lieutenant Peters said quietly. He'd already run the diagnostics 3 times. "Every system confirms the result." Thornton stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "I'm going down there. I need to see this for myself." He moved toward the door with the desperate energy of a man watching his worldview collapse in real time. Colonel Hartwell caught his arm. "Captain, before you go, there's something you need to know." He nodded to Peters, who pulled up a file on the main display. Sarah Brennan's service record filled the screen. Not the sanitized version that had been provided for her cover role, but the actual classified file that detailed her true history. Thornton's eyes scanned the text, his face transitioning through a spectrum of emotions. Confusion, disbelief, growing horror. Unit assignment, Naval Special Warfare Development Group. 11 combat deployments. Afghanistan 7 times. Iraq 3 times. Horn of Africa once. Plus 5 additional deployments to locations classified above top secret. Primary military occupational specialty, Special Operations Officer. Lead breacher qualified. Master training specialist in close quarters combat. High altitude, low opening parachutist. Combat diver. The decorations section read like a greatest hits compilation of American military valor. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with V device and 3 oak leaf clusters, meaning she'd earned it 4 separate times for 4 separate acts of combat heroism. Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, and at the bottom, highlighted in red because of its significance, the Navy Cross. The citation was partially redacted, but what remained was damning. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, Lieutenant Commander Brennan single-handedly held off an enemy force of more than 60 insurgents for 4 hours while directing the evacuation of 22 wounded SEALs. Despite sustaining 3 gunshot wounds, she maintained her position until all personnel were extracted. Her actions prevented the loss of American lives and demonstrated the highest traditions of military service. Thornton's hands were shaking. The tablet slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. She's DevGru. She's Team 6. Yes, Hartwell said. His voice was cold enough to frost glass. The woman you spent 3 days trying to break is one of the most decorated and combat-proven special operators in the entire United States military. The woman you drove your knee into yesterday with enough force to potentially cause permanent spinal injury has a Navy Cross for holding off 60 insurgents while wounded. The woman you called Sweetheart and Navy Princess has forgotten more about close-quarters combat than you'll ever know. The observation booth was silent except for the ambient hum of electronic equipment. Every person present was watching Thornton, waiting to see how he would respond to the revelation that he'd been spectacularly, catastrophically wrong about everything. I didn't know, Thornton whispered. How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to judge her based on her gender and size, General Patterson said. His voice cut through the room like a blade. You were supposed to evaluate her based on her performance, which, if you'd been paying attention instead of running your mouth, would have made it obvious she was operating on a completely different level than everyone else in your course. Hartwell gestured to Peters. Lieutenant, pull up the footage from yesterday. Day 3, 14:30 hours. The monitor switched to the video of Thornton driving his knee into Sarah's skull. The angle was perfect, capturing every detail. The force of the impact, the duration of the hold. Sarah's face pressed against the mat, the moment when Thornton ground his knee one final time before releasing her. Article 93 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Hartwell said. Cruelty and maltreatment. You assaulted a fellow officer during a training exercise. That's not tough instruction, Captain. That's criminal behavior. And thanks to 6 camera angles and 3 days of documented abuse, we have more than enough evidence to ensure you never wear this uniform again. Thornton's legs gave out. He collapsed into the chair behind him, his face ashen. I was trying to make her tougher, to prepare her for real combat. She's seen more real combat than you have by a factor of 3, Hartwell said. 11 deployments, multiple direct action missions, wounds in service of her country. What you did wasn't preparation, it was ego. You couldn't handle that. A woman had succeeded where you failed, so you tried to break her. You tried to prove she didn't belong, because deep down you know you're the one who doesn't belong in the Tier 1 community. The observation booth door opened. Sarah Brennan stepped inside, her rifle still slung across her chest, her face showing no expression beyond professional calm. She'd removed her plate carrier, and the bruising on her neck was visible now, purple and yellow against her pale skin. She walked directly to where Thornton sat. For a moment, she simply looked at him, and her eyes held all the cold judgment of someone who'd stared into the abyss and found it wanting. Captain Thornton, she said. Her voice was quiet but carried through the silent room with perfect clarity. 9 years ago, you were an instructor at Ranger School. One of your students was Lieutenant Rebecca Hayes. Do you remember her? Thornton's face was blank. I don't. You hazed her brutally. Multiple injuries that she never reported because she wanted to graduate. One of those injuries was chronic damage to her L4 and L5 vertebrae. In 2009, during combat operations in Ramadi, that old injury caused her to hesitate for 0.4 seconds during a building clearance. In that 0.4 seconds, an enemy combatant shot her through the throat. She died in my arms. Sarah pulled out the worn photograph and placed it on the console in front of Thornton. 2 young women in desert camouflage arms around each other, grinning despite exhaustion. Rebecca Hayes saved my life in Fallujah. She taught me to breathe under fire. She showed me what it meant to be a leader who earned respect through competence rather than demanded it through volume. When she died, her daughter was 4 years old. I went to that funeral. I held that little girl while she cried for her mother. And I promised her that her mother's death would mean something. That I would make sure people like you couldn't keep hurting people like her. Thornton was crying now, silent tears tracking down his face. I didn't remember her. I didn't. That's the problem, Captain. Sarah's voice remained level, but there was an edge to it now, sharp enough to cut. You never do. You break people and move on without a second thought. You tell yourself it's for their own good that you're making them stronger. But you're not. You're just feeding your own ego while people pay the price years later in ways you never see. She straightened. I endured 3 days of your abuse. I documented every moment. I built a case so complete that even the best military defense attorney in the country couldn't get you acquitted. I did this so that Rebecca's daughter, who's 19 now and applying to the Naval Academy, will never have to face an instructor like you. I did this so that every woman who comes after me will be judged on her abilities rather than your prejudices. Colonel Hartwell stepped forward. Captain Wade Thornton, you are hereby relieved of your instructor duties pending an investigation into multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Military police are waiting outside to escort you to confinement. You will be formally charged with Article 93, cruelty and maltreatment, as well as Article 92, dereliction of duty. Do you understand? Thornton nodded mutely. Two MPs entered the observation booth and moved to either side of him. They helped him to his feet with professional courtesy that their faces suggested they didn't feel. As they led him toward the door, he looked back at Sarah one final time. I'm sorry, he said. The words were pathetic, inadequate, but they were all he had. Your apology means nothing to Rebecca Hayes, Sarah replied, and it means nothing to her daughter. The only thing that matters now is that you can't hurt anyone else. The MPs escorted Thornton out. The door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin lid sealing. For a long moment, nobody in the observation booth spoke. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air like smoke after a firefight. General Patterson was the first to break the silence. He walked to where Sarah stood and came to attention. Then, in a gesture that sent shock waves through every person present, he saluted. A three-star general saluting a lieutenant commander, because rank meant nothing in the face of the kind of courage and sacrifice he'd just witnessed. Commander Brennan, he said, on behalf of the United States military, I apologize for what you endured. What we witnessed today wasn't just the finest display of close-quarters combat proficiency I've seen in my career. It was a demonstration of moral courage that few possess. You sacrificed yourself to protect others. That's the definition of heroism. Sarah returned the salute. Thank you, sir, but I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it needed to be done. The general lowered his hand and smiled, which is exactly why you're the kind of warrior this country needs. He turned to address the room. What happened here today becomes the foundation for new policy. Training protocols will be revised. Instructor oversight will be enhanced. And anyone who believes they can abuse their authority in the name of toughness will learn very quickly that the military no longer tolerates that behavior. He looked back at Sarah. The 47-second record you just set will stand as testament to what's possible when talent meets dedication. But more importantly, your willingness to endure abuse to protect others will become a teaching case for every leadership course in the military. Your story will save lives, Commander. Maybe not in combat, but in training facilities where the next generation is learning what it means to serve. Sarah nodded once. That's all I wanted, sir, for it to mean something. The observation booth gradually emptied as officers returned to their duties, each one stopping to shake Sarah's hand or offer words of respect. Soon only Colonel Hartwell remained with her, standing at the window that overlooked the kill house where she'd just rewritten the record books. You could have revealed your identity on day one, Hartwell said quietly. You could have ended this before it started. Then he would have hidden who he really is, Sarah replied. He would have been careful, political, and continued abusing soldiers in ways that couldn't be documented. This way he showed his true nature. The evidence is undeniable, and every instructor who watched that footage will think twice before they let their ego override their judgment. Hartwell turned to face her. Rebecca Hayes, her daughter. You're still carrying that. I'll always carry it, sir. That's what we do. We carry the ones we couldn't save forward, and we try to make sure their loss prevents future losses. She paused. Her daughter's name is Emily. She's 19. Smart, determined, wants to follow in her mother's footsteps. I write to her every year. Send her birthday cards. Try to fill some of the emptiness Rebecca left behind. You're a good person, Commander, Hartwell said. The military needs more like you. Sarah smiled slightly. The military needs fewer people like Thornton, sir. I'm just doing my part to make that happen. She collected her gear and walked out of the observation booth. The sun was higher now, burning through the morning clouds. The heat was oppressive, but Sarah barely noticed. She felt lighter than she had in 3 days, as if removing Thornton from his position had lifted a physical weight from her shoulders. Staff Sergeant Dalton was waiting outside the kill house. When he saw Sarah, he came to attention and saluted. Ma'am, I just wanted to say, what you did in there was beyond anything I've ever seen, and what you endured to make this happen. He trailed off, struggling for words. Thank you, Sergeant, Sarah said, but I had help. You offered to testify. That mattered. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why didn't you tell us who you were from the beginning? Sarah considered the question. Because rank and reputation shouldn't be what prevents abuse, Sergeant. The right thing should be the right thing regardless of who the victim is. If I'd led with my credentials, Thornton might have changed his behavior. But the next woman who came through one without a Navy Cross and DevGru behind her name, she'd have faced the same abuse. This way, the system changes. The culture changes. And maybe the next woman won't need to prove anything beyond her competence. Dalton nodded slowly. That's a hell of a sacrifice, ma'am. It's what we sign up for, Sergeant. We sacrifice so others don't have to. She paused. Besides, I got to set a facility record in the process. That's not nothing. For the first time in 3 days, she allowed herself a genuine smile. Dalton returned it, then excused himself to rejoin his unit. Sarah watched him go, then walked toward her barracks to collect her belongings. Her mission here was complete. Tomorrow, she would return to her DevGru unit to the classified operations and dangerous missions that defined her career. But today, she had ended a threat. Not with a rifle or a knife, but with patience, documentation, and the willingness to endure pain for a purpose greater than herself. It wasn't the kind of victory that would make headlines or earn medals, but it was the kind that would prevent future tragedies, and in Sarah's mind, that made it the most important kind of all. As she packed her duffel, she placed Rebecca Hayes' photograph in the center console of her rental car. The drive to Virginia would take 6 hours. 6 hours to prepare for a conversation she'd been rehearsing in her mind for 9 years. 10 years later, the Joint Urban Warfare Training Center looked different in the spring of 2034. New kill houses had been built. Training protocols had evolved. But Kill House 4 remained unchanged, a monument to the day as everything shifted. Emily Hayes stood in front of the brass casing mounted on its wooden plaque. She was 27 now, no longer the grieving 6-year-old who'd asked why her mother wasn't coming home. She wore the uniform of a Navy lieutenant, a seal trident gleaming on her chest. Her blonde hair, so like her mother's, was pulled back in a regulation bun. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan, the 47-second standard. Perfection is process, not performance. Assume nothing. Emily traced the engraving with her finger, the way she'd done dozens of times over the past decade. This place had become a pilgrimage site for her, a connection to the mother she barely remembered, and the woman who'd refused to let that memory fade. Your class starts in 20 minutes, Lieutenant. The voice came from behind her, and Emily turned to find a woman in her late 30s, scarred and weathered, but still carrying herself with that particular stillness that marked DevGru operators. Commander Sarah Brennan, now a senior instructor at the facility, walked forward with measured steps. Ma'am, Emily came to attention. At ease. Sarah stood beside her, looking at the plaque. You know, every time I see this, I think about your mother, about that day in Fallujah when she taught me to breathe through panic. 4 seconds, in 4 seconds, hold 4 seconds out. Still use it. Emily's voice was quiet. Commander, I need to ask you something. Something I've wondered about for 10 years. Go ahead. Was it worth it? 3 days of abuse, the pain, the risk. Was breaking Thornton worth what you endured? Sarah turned to face her fully. Your mother died because chronic pain from training injuries made her hesitate for 0.4 seconds. In those 0.4 seconds, I lost the finest officer I ever served with. You lost your mother. She paused. Since that day in 2024, not a single female operator has reported training abuse at this facility. 0. Across the entire special operations community, hazing complaints dropped 73%. That's not my number. That's SOC data. She gestured to the kill house. So yes, Emily, it was worth every bruise, because you're standing here wearing that trident without having to prove you deserve it through suffering. You proved it through competence. That's what your mother would have wanted. Emily's eyes filled but didn't overflow. She'd be proud of you, Commander. She'd be proud of you, Lieutenant. You earned that trident the right way, through skill, discipline, and dedication. Sarah placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. Your class today is running Kill House 4. It's tradition for second-generation SEALs. You ready? Emily looked at the brass casing one more time. Her mother's sacrifice, Sarah's courage, her own journey from grieving child to warrior. 3 generations of women connected by pain, transformed into purpose. Yes, ma'am, I'm ready. 90 minutes later, Emily Hayes completed the Kill House course in 1 minute and 12 seconds. The second best time in facility history. When she emerged, Sarah was waiting with a small box. Inside was a brass casing from Emily's final shot, polished to mirror shine, mounted on dark wood. The engraving read, Lieutenant Emily Hayes, 112, like mother, like mentor. The legacy continues. Emily held the plaque and finally let the tears come. Not tears of grief, but of completion. Her mother's death had led to Sarah's mission. Sarah's mission had protected Emily's path, and Emily's achievement honored them both. Sarah pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace. Your mother saved my life in Fallujah. I promised I'd honor that. Today, watching you complete this course, I know I kept that promise. They stood together in the shadow of Kill House 4, 2 warriors separated by years but united by legacy. Around them, the facility hummed with activity. Young operators preparing for deployment, instructors teaching without cruelty, a culture transformed by one woman's willingness to endure hell to prevent others from suffering the same. The brass casing would join Sarah's in the trophy case. 2 plaques, 2 warriors, one unbreakable legacy proving that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when courage chooses to stand against injustice, knowing the cost and paying it anyway.